Well, this is a really exciting thing. I heard Tiffany speak at a McMinnville sponsored event and was very, very impressed with her speaking, but also with the topic. This is such an interesting topic to me, and I hope, and obviously to you. Tiffany is a descendant of Chinese immigrants from Toisan. She is an educator with a nonprofit called Be the Bridge, and uses her background in communications to help bring Asian American history to life. I'd like to introduce you, Tiffany. Here we go.
All right, I'm on, right? Hello, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Okay. You got a testing. Yeah, we've got a sound guy who's going to help make sure you guys can hear me, and I will also try to project a little bit, even though I'm on a microphone. All right, so yes, my name is Tiffany Henness. I also go by Jade, and I began researching local Asian American history when my husband and I moved here in 2015. The organization I work for, Be the Bridge, is focused on racial literacy education. And one of the things that we encourage people to do is learn about the history of different people groups in the place you're currently living. And so I thought, okay, we've moved to McMinnville. Wouldn't it be great to learn about the history of different people groups here in this area? And so I started asking around, and I would hear things like, there was an Oriental Garden restaurant that wasn't allowed to open up inside McMinnville, so it was on the outside of town. And I would hear things like, there's a Chinese underground in McMinnville, and there were tunnels, and it's haunted down there. And all of these different stories, myths, legends, locally in the community are kind of floating out there. So because I'm nosy, I was like, well, who did you hear that from? Let me go talk to them. What do you know? Can you tell me something? Can you share what you know? So I actually was able to meet Marilyn Warricks before she sold the building on 3rd Street, which used to be the old Elks Lodge. So this building is on the historic register. It was built in 1908. And her and her late husband, Matthew, purchased the building, I believe, in the 90s and renovated it. And at some point during that renovation, they realized that there were all of these Chinese artifacts in the basement and that there were characters sprayed up on the wall, Chinese characters written down there. A lot of the stuff was sort of moved out by the company they had hired to gut things before they were like, stop. We need to know what this is before you take anything else. And so that sent Matthew Warricks on this journey to learn about this history. And he and his friend Carl Smith spent many years as a personal hobby and passion turning that basement into something of a museum or cultural space to honor the history of Chinese Americans in Oregon and in the U.S. And I have a picture. I'll talk a little bit about that later of the space down there. But meeting Marilyn and getting to do a tour with her really just, my imagination went all over the place. And I thought, like, man, wouldn't it be great to start collecting these stories and start getting more of this information all together in one place and then be able to share it down here in this really unique basement space. So that is kind of how I got to the point of giving presentations about this history. I'm just really nosy, and I started collecting information and asking people questions. And part of what really connected me to the stories I'm going to share about local history is my own family's history. So while I'm learning about local history, I'm also trying to learn about my own Chinese family's history. My grandparents on the Chinese side of my family came from Toisan, and it was my great-grandparents on both sides who immigrated first. And then they brought their children, my grandpa Wong, my grandma Sue, they came, and the same time period of history and from the same little village area is the people who lived here kind of went through the same things that my great-grandparents and my grandparents went through. So some of the things I have found are still very recent. For example, this is a photo of Charlie Lee. He lived in McMinnville for about 25 years, and in 1938, the local newspaper shared a little bit about his story and put this picture in the newspaper. And Michael Hafner, who works at News Register, he knows I'm looking for these old history things, and anytime he's going through the archives, if he sees something, he'll snap a photo and he'll be like, oh, Tiffany wants to see this. So I just got this photo like 2 weeks ago. I've seen Charlie's name on the census records, so I knew that he was here. But this, just a couple weeks ago, I got to see his face for the first time. And I thought, oh, that's gonna be my first picture on my slide, because I'm so excited about that. So let's see. Oh, this is my family. So going back to a little bit of that personal history. Oh, here we go. So let me see here. This is my great-grandpa Quan. He served in World War I. He was born in San Francisco in 1890. On the far side, can I go past here, or is my mic gonna be funny? This is my great-grandpa Wang, and he immigrated to Canada when he was 11 years old in 1923. He got to Vancouver, Canada, June 23rd, 1923, and Canada's Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect July 1st. So he got there just at the buzzer. And then their two children get married, and those are my grandparents, Grandpa Jin and Grandma Sue. And this is their wedding, actually, with younger siblings and nieces and nephews. So this is a photo I just saw for the first time a couple weeks ago as well. And when I share this history, it's always quite personal and meaningful for me. And part of it is so meaningful because it's so hard to find. Few Chinese immigrants whose families have been here this long still have photos or have grandparents that want to share too much about their history and all that they've lived through. And so I feel really honored to know as much as I do. And here locally, when it comes to Chinese history in Oregon, I feel really honored every time I get another piece of the puzzle to put together for Oregon or for Yamhill County. So, recovering histories can be really hard, and there's a few reasons why. So let's kind of look at some fun pictures. This is an image. If you can see it clearly, I always ask people, like, what does this look like to you? What kind of place does this look like, and what's happening? I would not be able to tell you. I would say this is a factory, but I wouldn't know what they were doing. Apparently, this is a fish cannery, and there looks like men are pushing carts of cans or stuffing cans. There's something's going on here. They have like top hats and mustaches and vests and some aprons, you know. But they're clearly Western European looking in their attire and their hairstyles. And this was an image of this early American Pacific Northwest fish cannery industry, which was pretty big here. back in the day. But the interesting thing about this story is that this isn't the original sketch. This was the original.
Interesting.
Instead of the mustached Western European men in clothes, we have the Chinese workers of the M.J. Kinney Cannery in Astoria. They have the signature shaved foreheads of the Qing dynasty. Their braided queues are probably secured up on the back of their heads. They're wearing collarless tunics and waist-wrapped aprons, different style. But they're doing same work, same posture, same thing is happening. So during this time in history, the 1880s, Pacific Northwest fish canneries hired almost exclusively Chinese workers. And it's interesting that the image would have been changed to depict Western men at work instead. Maybe they did that for a similar reason, that this picture only depicts Western Europeans as well. You guys probably know what this image is. This is the photograph that was the celebration of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Huge American accomplishment, had enormous impact on the development of our nation, right? Connecting East and West by rail. So these two trains have come together, and the crews working on the two different lines, they're shaking hands. I'm pretty sure that's a bottle of champagne. And they're celebrating. Historian and journalist Helen Zia, one of my role models, says this about this moment in time. The speeches congratulated European immigrant workers for their labor, but never mentioned the Chinese. Instead, Chinese men were summarily fired and forced to walk the long distance back to San Francisco, forbidden to ride on the railroad they built. And so this is a painting done by a Chinese-American artist, Mian Situ, depicting the 10 miles in one day. The two different railroad lines got in a competition to see who could lay the most track in one day. And the winning side laid 10 miles of track in one day. I cannot imagine how hard that must have been. But this is his visualization of that great feat, and front and center are the Chinese workers. So sometimes I think, well, what does it matter if the Chinese workers were replaced by the Europeans in the image of the fish cannery? It makes me wonder, when I think about that, well, where else has that kind of happened? Where else have we sort of failed to include or mention everyone who is a part of this history? Historian with the Oregon Historical Society, Jennifer Fong, writes that Chinese are among the earliest generations of non-Indigenous people to settle in this part of Oregon, yet Oregon's public memory largely excludes those early Chinese residents' role in shaping the state's development. And so I think, okay, well, what about our local history? I thought this was really interesting. Census records are really important for genealogy and trying to track down historical figures. And it also just gives you a picture of who was living where at what time. Today, we can all go online and we can look up the 1880 census, and we can see the original documents because they've been digitized and indexed. You can search by name and date and location, and you can find people. But it wasn't that long ago. If I had a younger crowd, it might take some convincing, but it wasn't that long ago that we didn't have the internet, right? And so the only way to access things like census data from 1880 would be to visit your local historical society, genealogical society. Maybe the library would have a copy, because some volunteer would have gone and typed it up, MS-DOS style, dot matrix printers. If anybody remembers those, I remember those. And they would have had a printed out list in a binder that was available for you to go and see who was on the census. So when I started looking for the history in this area, it surprised me. I went to the library and the Historical Society, and these are the 125 names, all of them Chinese except for one, who was a Japanese man, that were left out of the locally available printed copies of the 1880 census. So I went to the library, I looked through it a couple times, I was like, I'm not seeing any of these people. And I told Jenny, I was like, I have a list of names, can you add it? I know that this is obsolete, we use the internet now, but I would just like them to be in the binder too. So whoever had volunteered to type up the 1880 census had skipped these people, probably not maliciously. They were probably thinking that people wouldn't be looking for these names if they were doing a genealogy of their family locally. But consequently, if you are a young or new researcher going off local resources, it would almost appear as if no Chinese people lived here in the 1880s, but there were quite a few, right? Another thing that's a local example is demonstrated in this picture from Upper City Park, where the old grist mill used to be. And one of the signs that have been placed here tells the history of this site. And it says, the small brick wall you see behind you and the brick-lined flume you see before you are the remnants of the 4-mile trench that William T. Newby constructed in 1857 to bring water to McMinnville's first grist mill that sat atop the far hillside in what is now Upper City Park. Newby received special permission to build the ditch and flume system that diverted water all the way from Baker Creek to this area. It's a great little bit of local history. And when I read it, my first thought is, William T. Newby gets a shovel and digs a 4-mile trench. Did that take him 2 decades? Like, how did that happen exactly? And what I found, so Jim and Rita Lockett did a lot of local history. They were involved heavily with the Yamhill County Historical Society. They wrote this book about local history, and in it they say, we know that Newby hired 300 Chinese workers to dig that canal. And that's not mentioned in the public sign that sort of discusses this, this history or this past. 300 workers is a lot. Sorry, I'm getting a spam call, of course. My warranty has expired, okay. But 1857, so I looked at the census records of 1860 for McMinnville, and I only found like 471 people. So can you imagine this town of maybe 500 people, and then in comes 300 Chinese guys to dig this 4-mile trench. That must have been an interesting time. It must have been an interesting time. And I think, well, you know, how long did it take? Where did they stay? Maybe they just camped out. Maybe it was, you know, the nice weather time of the year. Did any of them stay or want to stay? A lot of immigrants came to this area, saw the beautiful land and opportunity and wanted to stay. They would have too. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those who did stay in a minute. But what I think is interesting is that when I talk to people who have heard about Oriental Garden Restaurant or they've heard about the Chinese Underground, very few people have heard about how influential and how important Chinese workers were to local industry and agriculture in the very beginning of McMinnville, which this grist mill was put in, I think, 2 years after Newby platted McMinnville and really started getting this town built up. So here's a quote that I love. It says that where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. And this was said by Georges Erasmus, a Canadian Native American leader. So common memory and community is kind of the whole goal of the group that I represent, We are just getting started. We're calling ourselves the Asian Heritage Association, AHA for short. I love that so much. And here's some photos of some of us. You might recognize some faces. So the Asian Heritage Association, we are just a group of local Asian Americans who live, work, or play in Yamhill County, plus some non-Asian friends and neighbors. And our goals are to facilitate community, to preserve local Asian American history, and to promote Asian American culture and arts. This last February, we put on a huge Lunar New Year celebration in McMinnville. I think we had about 1,000 people come through. Many wanted to see the lion dancers, which was really crowded at that point in time. But as a group, we're currently in the process of getting formally set up with a nonprofit fiscal sponsor so that we can pursue some fun projects in the community. Specifically, we're looking to add, McMinnville has a lot of really great murals, and so we're looking at doing a mural that would celebrate our local Asian American history and culture, and then also to work on that museum space, to get it to a place where we could give tours on a regular basis. Right now, it is very much not up to code. It is not safe to have it open to the public. So some work would need to be done to get it to that point. All right, so let's go and do a little bit of history. Some of you probably know some of this, but I feel like it's always good to do a little refresher and give some context. When we talk about why Asian people migrated to the US, we usually think of two things: the gold rush and the railroads. And those are definitely big pull factors for immigration, but there was a lot of other things that brought Chinese and Asian people to America. First, Asian people came to the Americas way before the gold rush through the Spanish Manila galleon trade. And so from the 16 to 1800s, I've got a little sketch drawing of one of those Spanish galleon ships. And let me see, if I get off my notes, we will never get back. Okay. So actually, these ships would go from Manila to Acapulco. They would bring luxury goods for trade back and forth, but they recruited a lot of Filipino and Chinese sailors for these trips. And so if you've heard of the famous Nehalem beeswax shipwreck off the coast of Oregon, the belief is that that was, from the 1600s, one of these Spanish galleons that was carrying Chinese luxury goods like porcelains and silk and beeswax that ended up washing up on the shore of Nehalem like for a long time. And I think it was maybe even inspired the movie The Goonies a little bit. So it's possible that a shipwrecked Chinese sailor was in Oregon in the 1600s. Of course, we have no idea if that's true or not, but I like to think it is. Then we have the early 1800s. So I have two pictures there. The sketch of the woman on the left is a newspaper sketch meant to represent Ah Fong Moi. She's considered the first Chinese woman to be in the United States in the 1830s. And she kind of represents how like this Western desire for Asian goods brought a lot of Chinese Asian people to the area. She was actually contracted with American businessmen to be something of a human exhibit. So they would travel around and they would sell tickets to come and see this exotic Chinese woman. Her feet were bound. She would wear her ethnic dress. She would serve tea and sit there in her little decorated room. And when people would come to see her, then the businessmen would then sell all of the goods that they had brought. So it's an interesting mix of it feels a little bit exploitative. Maybe more than a little bit, because once they were sort of done with using her as a draw to pull people, she kind of just disappears off of the history books, and we aren't really sure what happened to her. The other image it's really tiny at the bottom, but it says, quote unquote, enraged coolie. And this is another thing about history that's kind of hard to learn, but when the transatlantic slave trade was closing down, that was becoming banned, there were a lot of plantations in South America and all over the world who had relied on that as labor. And they switched instead to indentured labor from Asian countries, India, China, the Philippines. And a lot of recruiting to bring Chinese men to these plantations, even like Louisiana or in South America, wasn't really done on the up and up. They would make these promises, you're gonna come work for this much, and then you'll get the money you need, you can go home. And really they would get there, and in a lot of cases it would end up being little better than slavery in actual practice. And so there was a lot of immigration prior to even the traditional like railroad gold rush that was centered around bringing over cheap labor to fill the roles that slaves used to fill. And then this last part here, in the mid-1800s, China itself has a lot of crazy things going on that pushed Chinese people to come to places like Yamhill County. And this little sketch is a depiction of an interethnic conflict called the Punti-Hakka Wars. And this really impacted the area of China that my great-grandparents were born and my grandparents were born. There's the Hakka people and the Cantonese people, and there was this generations-long conflict between the two, and the fighting left millions dead. There was also famine, floods, and then there was British invasion, the Opium Wars. So seeking opportunities elsewhere was a really, really good idea. Oh, I went the wrong way. All right, so when I said earlier that my family came from Toisan, this is, hopefully it helps if you're a map person. Here's China, and down here is the Guangdong province. If we explode the Guangdong province, we have this little county, Toisan, which is land-wise kind of about the same size as Yamhill County. Population-wise, today it's closer to like Portland. So this is where a lot of folks we talk about here, they probably came from this area of China. Toisan is known as the hometown of overseas Chinese. They would have spoken their own language, Hoisanwa. They probably also would have spoken Cantonese because that was the big city language. And then they got here and probably learned English. So by the time they were here, they're already on their third, maybe fourth language. And as they come over, I love this photo. We don't get a lot of really honest or great photos or depictions of Chinese immigrants in history, but this artist, again, Mian Si-tu, he kind of reimagines history and tries to paint really a really humane and like wholesome look at the lives of Chinese immigrants. So this one is called The Golden Mountain. The Chinese immigrants are on the ship. They've spotted land. There's some celebration. Looks like the mother in front is rousing her sleep or maybe seasick kid. I don't know. Maybe he's asleep, maybe he's seasick. But they're sort of bathed in this golden light, which evokes, hope, opportunity, the new worlds. They've seen Gamsan, Golden Mountain, otherwise known as America. And some of them found their way to Oregon and Yamhill County. So let's talk more local stuff. One of the things that really surprised me when I started digging up local history was just how many things Chinese workers did here locally. I had no idea. Most of them, when you read about stories of Chinese immigrants, a lot of them wanted to earn enough money to send money home because their families were still struggling with war, still struggling with famine. And so finding gainful employment and being able to earn enough to send some remittance money home was a really big deal. Another thing was some of them wanted to earn enough to bring their family here and start new here. And we'll talk about two of those local gentlemen here in a little bit. But locally, Chinese immigrants took a lot of jobs, like whatever they could, which meant a lot of menial labor. A lot of the farmland here throughout Yamhill County, I mean, it used to be oak groves. It used to be this wild west. And that land got cleared, the trees cut down, the stumps dug up by hand by Chinese workers. So European immigrant would come, get his land claim, and then hire Chinese workers to come and to help clear fields so he could start planting crops. Also, like we talked about, building the mill races, digging the canals, railroad construction. Also picking and harvesting. So whether it was strawberries and potatoes, hop growing was really big in this part of the Willamette Valley. And a lot of times it was Chinese workers in the fields, packing that produce, sending it off to market. There's also on the census records quite a few instances where a younger Chinese man was a domestic servant for a family. Laundryman was a huge thing, which we'll talk about as well. Here in the Wild West, where there were less women to do the laundering, there was a big need, huge market for laundry services. So while they weren't laundrymen back home, they realized that if they offered that service here, it would be very welcome. And then cook, being a cook for a restaurant, a hotel. Several of the local restaurants and hotels had Chinese cooks. Or if the family was wealthy enough, if a Western European family was wealthy enough to have a private cook, sometimes that would actually be a Chinese person. Opening up merchant shops, groceries, restaurants. These are the kinds of things that happened locally around Yamhill County, but more so in some of the bigger areas, Salem, Portland, but definitely here as well. So in 2021, the Oregon Historical Quarterly came out with this awesome special edition, which is just a wonderful resource of information. But in that, they said that the Chinese in Oregon are more than just tangential to the state's history. They're central actors in Oregon's past. Chinese immigrants and migrants and immigrants have shaped the state's economic and industrial development, political landscape, and categories of race. And so it's interesting to think about one of those big contributions locally being the local railroad lines. So the big railroads are done. Transcontinental Railroad is done. A lot of Chinese railroad workers are out of a job. But all of these local arteries of railroads are being put in. And so I think it was about 1885 in my notes when the railroad was built through Sherwood. There was a huge encampment of Chinese workers in the Newburgh area up on Parrot Mountain. And if you Google this article, it's available online. This article, Digging Up History, talks about this Linfield group of students with the archaeology professor who go to this area of Parrot Mountain, and they're looking for remnants of where that encampment was. They know it was there because one of the daughters of the family wrote about it in her diary, that she would pass the encampment of Chinese workers on her way to school. And so they know, like, we've got to find where this is. So they go and they're digging up, looking through the brush, looking around old building sites. They didn't find it. This was 2009. But I still hope that the Chehalem Park and Recreation District will encourage other people to continue to look for that site and find that site. But they were there for quite some time. All right, another person. So now an individual. This is probably the only earliest photograph, like of the earliest Chinese person in McMinnville that I can find a photograph of. Again, historian Jennifer Fong said there's a tendency to think that Chinese were only unskilled, illiterate workers, but they were also craftsmen, cowboys, businessmen, entrepreneurs who developed international business partnerships, and I would add they were also academics and missionaries. So this is Sam Sung Bo, and the image I found of him writes that he is a resident of McMinnville, a student, a ministry student at the Baptist College of McMinnville, which later became McMinnville College, which later became Linfield College, now Linfield University. So he's got a Western hairstyle and dress. He wasn't a miner sifting for gold. He wasn't working the railroad crew. Sam was most likely a convert to Christianity, fluent in English, and a regular at church on Sunday. I hope I find out more about him, but so far, this is all I know about Sam. Another one of my favorite historical figures to study about. There's a lot about Quan Hop locally. This man defied stereotypes as well. He lived in North Yamhill, and this is a newspaper sketch of him from 1894, and I colorized it to kind of make it more interesting. But his name probably wasn't Hop. Quan, a family surname, they probably called him Quan Hop to distinguish him from other Quans. He worked for a hop grower south of Newburgh. And that's how he came to North Yamhill. The hop grower came up here for a meeting of other hop growers, and Quan came along with him, realized there was a need for laundry services. Nobody was providing that service in that area, so he stayed, and with the help of his former employer, got set up with his equipment to start his own laundry business in Yamhill. So he was living in Yamhill by the late 1880s, and over the course of nearly 40 years, he becomes this regular fixture in the local community. He went from being a hop farmer to a laundry owner. Later, he converts to operating a soda and a sandwich shop. And I've recently heard that there's mentions that he owned a noodle shop in McMinnville as well. This man was expanding his empire. Here's another photo that's marked as Quan Hop in the research that Matthew Warricks has collected. I'm not really sure where he got it from, but I hope to find out. So some other things we know about Quan was that he converted to Christianity in 1895 and he joined the Union Church. He also hosted Chinese New Year celebration dinners at his place. One time, the local newspaper reports that 75 ladies and gentlemen of the town were in attendance at his Chinese New Year dinner. He sang Chinese songs and performed silly skits at the local church. He would joke with people and the kids. And his shop was like a social hangout for young kids after school, probably helped by the fact that he had a really, really deep well, and apparently the beer on the end of his rope was really cold. Coldest beer in town, Quan's. So it's interesting, in the newspaper records I found, Quan also applied for naturalization, which of course was illegal because this was the Chinese exclusion era. His inability to naturalize meant that he couldn't vote, he couldn't buy land or own land. But the newspapers at the time report that the county clerk did accept his application. This was back when the county clerk handled immigration. He accepted his certificate of naturalization, and it caused a bit of a scandal. I think it caused the county clerk to lose the next election. His certificate of naturalization, it later says in the newspapers, was forcibly returned and at considerable expense. In the 1920s, some of the local oral histories say that Quan wanted to return back to China to die. He was old, he was unable to be a citizen here, and there, in China, he had grandkids he'd never met. His friends at the Union Church helped him pay for his trip home, and that is the last anyone saw of Quan Hop in the 1920s. Now, Chinese laundrymen, this is where I met Lynn. I gave a whole presentation about laundries, Chinese laundries. I never realized Chinese laundries would be so fascinating, but I actually find them to be rather fascinating history. So these are the towns that had at least one, if not two, if not three, Chinese laundries in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And one of the things that was really funny to me was when you learn about the history of laundry as a business, immigrants on the West Coast, some of them would ship their laundry to Hawaii to get it done. Can you imagine shipping your dirty drawers to Hawaii to have it done? There's an ad for laundry services here locally, and it says, "Don't send your laundry to Portland." And I'm like, Portland? People were sending their sweaty socks to Portland? Like, that's just wild. So yes, laundry services were a huge need. And, but that was not pleasant work. And it was a lot more difficult than it is now. I put my laundry in a thing, I push a button, and then it beeps and it's done. Not how it was back in the day. Really taxing physical labor. So while Chinese men didn't do laundry in China, they came here, they saw an opportunity, they adapted, they survived, they found a way to make a living. So Chinese laundries were so successful in getting Chinese people established in communities that laws were passed against Chinese laundry businesses to try to prevent them from getting too established. And so it's kind of neat to just know that all of these places, Amity, Carleton, Dayton, Lafayette, Newburgh, McMinnville, Sheridan, one of the easiest ways to find where they were is to look at the old Sanborn fire insurance maps that mark out the city, and they tell you what type of structure was here, if it was a wooden structure, if they had a stove, things like that. And they'll mark Chinese wash house where those were located. So I found a few of those maps for most of these. My most favorite person to talk about is the Chinese laundryman from McMinnville named Sam Yik. From census data, it looks like Sam immigrated in 1878, possibly a teenager at the time, pretty young. But as early as 1884, those fire insurance maps show that McMinnville's Chinese laundry was located about where the Aquatic Center is today. And at the time, that was the edge of town, okay? And again, Newbie has built this mill race. Water is coming all the way from Baker Creek to that edge of town. So laundrymen need a good water source, and they've got it right there. The runoff from the mill pond heading down to Cozine Creek, plenty of water for a laundry. So 2 laundries actually set up on that edge of town. Sam Yik is first mentioned in the telephone register in 1888, first mention that I can find so far. I could always change that if I find earlier mention, but the local news section reports that Sam Yik said that General Washington must have been a great man because he wash-y ton. And when I read that, I was like, this guy was a joker, okay? Like, he's poking fun at his own accent and just having a good time meeting people, and he is trying to connect with the community, okay? That same year, the newspaper notes that Sam Yik is distributing Chinese lilies for Chinese New Year's. So here he is. Chinese sacred lilies are actually sometimes paper white daffodils. So that's why I have that picture up there. Carved bulbs make the flowers like turn and twist in interesting ways. The newspaper also mentions him as having invited the town to come see the painting and decorating done by a Chinese artist who he had invited to visit him for 2 weeks and who painted and decorated the inside of his business. So he's sharing culture, he's sharing art, he is sharing jokes. He's mentioned several times by name in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which I think is really, really striking. He's not just washman or Chinaman, he's Sam Yik. He gets the flu. It's noted in the newspaper with the lawyers and editors and folks of the town who got the flu. And in 1938, that picture I showed you at the beginning of Charlie Lee, that was from 1938 article talking about folks who used to live in McMinnville, they also mentioned Sam Yik lower in that article. They called him the most colorful of all Chinese characters, telling how he attended every funeral, contributed to celebrations, charitable events, social events, joined the church, took in sporting events, remembered everybody on Chinese New Year's with candy, nuts, and lily bulbs. So he was here for several decades. Here's some of those newspaper clippings where I found mentions of him. This is 1890, and it says Sam Yik and brother leave next week for China. Sam will return with his wife. He intends to buy property upon his return. He also said he intended to send his children to the public school. All same Melican man. Seems to be counting his chickens a little too soon. So Chinese exclusion started in 1882, but in 1890, that first act was supposed to expire in 1892, but it got renewed with the Geary Act and was indefinite. So I'm thinking Sam is thinking, oh, Chinese exclusion is going to end in 2 years. I'm going to go home, get my family settled, we'll be back. But that's not how history happened. In fact, I think that he might have brought his family as far as Portland. I've looked at shipped manifest records. I have found an incoming vessel with Sam Yik and some other folks with his same family name, but the other folks are marked for deportation. And in 1894, this article said, Sam Yik, who left here for his native country 2 or 3 years ago, has returned with his family and is now in Portland. But then, less than a year later, Sam Yik, the popular and intelligent Chinaman, returned to McMinnville Friday, resumed his former business. He left his family in China. So either one, they got here and his wife was like, nope, not staying here. Or two, they were not allowed entry and deported. He escorted them home and then came back on his own. Not sure, but regardless, he was here until at least 1910. He's on the 1910 census. The fire insurance maps of 1912 show there's still a Chinese laundry in McMinnville, about where the fire department is now, in 1912. But what happens to him after that, I don't know, and hope that I'll find more information sometime in the future. But clearly in 1938, local stories about him are still circulating, and they share about him in the local newspaper. All right, a few more slides here. So earlier I talked about Marilyn Warricks, who is shown here on the left. And she's the one who gave me a tour of the basement down there. Marilyn Kossel, new Marilyn, on the right. Wait, no, I got that wrong. Marilyn Warricks on the right, Marilyn Kossel on the left. It's okay. She's the current building owner, Marilyn Kossel is. And she's been working with us, with the Asian Heritage Association, to get this basement space to a point where we can do some tours. But these are the characters that are painted up on the doorway and a couple of the walls. It says Chongqing Restaurant, capital city of the Sichuan province. We don't know when that was done, but we know that it was, it could have been 1920s, 1930s, it could have been maybe more the 40s. There was a brief period of time, I believe, the Chinese Nationalist Party used Chongqing as their capital city. So perhaps the folks down there named themselves Chongqing Restaurant to signify that they were a nationalist party. I don't know. But this is the space that we're hoping to make available for tours and to share these kinds of histories. And then the restaurant, Oriental Garden. So I mentioned that. This is Jimmy Louie, an article about his restaurant back in the day. He came here, also from Toisan, came here with his family. We've been able to have his son, Richard Louie, right, who still owns property here, does business in McMinnville, but lives in the Portland area. Richard has been helping us get our Asian Heritage Association started, helped us a lot with our Lunar New Year celebration, and soon I'm going to be able to meet with Richard and his sister to record oral histories about their time. I mean, they grew up working in their dad's restaurant. Richard went to Linfield College. So it's going to be great to have that as a resource, that story about their family. But yes, he says that when his dad and his partners were looking to get started in a business somewhere, the only place that they could rent was outside of the city limits, the only place that they could get a lease. But Oriental Garden became quite popular, I understand. it was the place to be. Richard said that he remembers at 5 o'clock, his dad would have the whole bar lined up with a specific drink for a specific patron who was going to come and sit a specific stool as soon as they got off work. And yeah, so he has fond memories of that time. And his father, who is in his 90s now, I think in the Beaverton area, is maybe he doesn't want to have to sit down and do a oral history, but he's still with us, and so they can still ask questions of him about his time here. But one of the things that's interesting about this history, I think Jimmy Louie's story is often used as a bit of the history of McMinnville and the probability that McMinnville was a sundown town. And I have up here that between 1890 and 1968, thousands of sundown towns were established across the United States. And a lot of times we think about that as excluding black people, like don't let the sun go down while you're still in town kind of thing. But along the West Coast, where anti-Chinese, anti-Asian sentiment was very strong, sundown laws would include Chinese, would include Jewish people in some places. And so the idea that a Chinese person wouldn't be able to open up a business here is often used as part of the argument for McMinnville's history as a sundown town. Now, I know I talk mainly about Chinese American history in this presentation, but because we are the Asian Heritage Association and we include other Asian ethnic groups, I always feel like I've got to mention this. The history of the Japanese onion farmers of Yamhill and Gaston area. So there were at least 60 Japanese residents of North Yamhill area that were forced into internment camps in the 1940s. And so I've got the names here of the ones that I've been able to find on the Japanese internee data files. Most of these folks were sent to Minidoka or Tule Lake internment camps. They were farming families with kids ranging from newborns to their 20s. The young man in the photo is Chuck Furumasu. His family moved from here to Idaho to avoid an internment, actually. He did join the military, and after he got out, he came back to Gaston, and he married Amy. So Amy Furukawa became Amy Furumasu. She was in 8th grade when her family was forced into the livestock facility, aka Portland Assembly Center. And then her family got separated between Tule Lake and Minidoka internment camps. But you can hear more. Amy did an oral history with the hifumien.org. They have videos up there of Japanese American oral histories. So you can hear her story online. But that's a part of our local history. I think it's important for us to remember too. And my last person I love to mention is Amy Tan, because she's one of my favorite authors. I like to remind everyone that she briefly attended Linfield in 1969, 1970. She met her husband here on a blind date, but then they transferred to San Jose together and they were gone. But I think she's probably the most famous Asian person to have lived in Yamhill County. I don't know. At least I think it's awesome that she was here. All right, so here's some recommended resources. Oh, I forgot I had a mic. Resources that I have found very helpful in my research, but I also, because I go by Tiffany or Jade, if you want to email me, jade@ahaYC.org, Asian Heritage Association, YamhillCounty.org, you can contact me there. And yeah, that's it, I'm done. If there's questions, comments, tips, no, just kidding.
I have the mic. Well, I had the mic. I have the mic. All right. Can you hear? Well, I got to mute. Okay, now can you hear me? Hello. All right, Joanne.
I was honored to be able to visit the underground. Are there any plans at all to restore it and make it accessible to the public?
There is the hope that we can do that, but we got to do our due diligence first. So Our first step is to get ourselves formalized as an organization so that we can have an agreement with the building owner, Marilyn Kossel, so that we can bring some folks down there to tell us what is the state of this 1908 building basement and what would we need to do to get it to the point where it would be up to code, accessible by the public, ADA accessible. That could be really, that could be a big struggle. So we want to start going through that process of seeing what it would take. I imagine it would take quite a bit, but that is our plan as a group, is to be driving that effort. Yeah.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Just a second. Oh, wait. Oh, just a second. Okay.
How to join your organization?
Well, that's a great question. I would say if you're interested, to go ahead and send me an email first off. Once we have our group sort of formally put together, then we're going to have a place where people can contact us if you want to attend events, volunteer, be a part of one of our group projects that we're doing. We'll be able to make that available to an email list or a contact list. We also have a website we're trying to get together. This is all volunteer, work we're doing outside of our day jobs and family lives. So once we have that website up too, that will be a great place to find out about what's going on and how to participate.
Have you ever encountered a friend of mine who has passed on, Jack Chan, who is, his name is Chinese, but he was Japanese. His stepfather was Chinese.
Okay, Bob you just told me about him. Yes. I didn't get a chance to.
He has children living in McMinnville. I know at least two daughters.
That's great. Oh, that's great.
Anyway, he was a very interesting man.
Well, I'm good at internet stalking. Maybe I can find them.
Any other questions? Close your mouth. Close up your mouth.
Okay. All right, I have another close to home item that you might be interested in.
Yeah.
About 6 miles out of Amity, close to the railroad track, is a house that my son is living in and his family, and it was built in 1811. And they're fixing it up again now because they have moved into another house that's more for their age to list. But years ago, the railroad that was close to their house, and there was many Chinese that built that railroad.
Yeah.
And this house was a place where they lived. And it had a stairway that was very small, and they had to lift up the roof or the flooring from the second floor to be able to get down the stairway. And I have walked down myself years ago. Very narrow and very twisting and winding, and it comes down to near to the kitchen.
Okay.
And in times when there was warnings that there was going to be some people coming to check who they were and if they were legal, they had a way to escape that. And they would go down that stairway and they would get away.
Oh my gosh.
So the house is still standing.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And it was in a Fanning name too.
Oh, wow. Okay. I definitely would have to follow up with that because that is the most brilliant thing I've heard.
Well, yeah. Oh, one more.
I'm Chinese, as I told you, and from Toisan.
Woohoo!
That is, my grandparents were, and my parents too. But one thing you've not mentioned, in Portland at least, and I think all around the West Coast, large Chinatowns would have Chinese lottery.
Oh, yeah.
There's a Chinese poem with 80 characters. 5 on top, and the characters would be read from top to bottom, left to right. And that was the lottery ticket that would be marked. And Portland's Chinatown had a lot of lottery owners.
Oh, wow.
My dad made his living that way.
Oh, nice.
And what would happen is that in Portland anyway, the train station had a lot of black workers. And they would walk by our place and they would like to buy a lottery ticket, mark 9 or 10 spots on the ticket, and there would be drawings twice a day, one in the afternoon, early, one later. And my dad did that, but I also helped with passing the lottery drawings out with my brothers. Run around down Chinatown and leave it at various herb shops,
Nice.
groceries, restaurants for pickup by people from all over Portland.
Wow.
So that was part of our history that you haven't kind of shown here.
Well, maybe
You
I
might
should
be able to
include
look
that.
it up, because I remember looking up online
Yeah?
about Chinese lottery.
All right, starting next week, you can get your lottery tickets from Bob. That would be awesome. That's really cool.
History
Richard
lives
about that.
on. I think we'll start right now. We'll stop. But I want you all to thank Tiffany for a wonderful, wonderful speech.
Thank you.
See what happens when you corner people. We have snacks in the back. I'm sure Tiffany will stay here for a few minutes if you want to talk to her. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you in October.